welcome to the show. Welcome to the show, guys. It's a great pleasure to have you on. We've been in the works for this for a little while. I will have to say this is obviously like a heavy moment right now. It's like hard to like think about anything that's not Palestine. But we had this scheduled and it's been a long time. And actually, if anything, it's like reading this book and preparing for this interview has been a good, healthy, I would say, like distraction and like, it's from just the horrors of this moment. So I decided let's just keep this going and record and I can release it. And because it does have to do with a lot of the sort of situation we're in today in terms of the extremely lopsided sort of historical conversations. But before we get into that, can you guys introduce yourselves? Henry, viewers of the show know you. People know you, but I'll let you two do it.
Salvatore, you might as well go first.
All right. First of all, it's a great pleasure, and I'm honored to have been invited here. Thank you very much, Sina. I've been also listening to your podcast for a while, and I really appreciate your work. I am a really a pleasure. I'm a geographer, and I've done quite a bit of work in various themes, various fields of subfields, mainly the physical geography and history of socialist movements and countries increasingly the histories of socialist countries with particular emphasis on the environmental records. In any case, a lot of the research that I do might not resonate with people listening, but in case there is interest, I've been trying to develop a dialectical materialist approach to soil science and also practicing soil science in some respects in terms of contamination processes in urban community gardens. So I'll leave it at that.
No, I'm sure lots of people would be interested in that. But yeah, thank you for that, Salvatore.
And listeners who are interested in that should pick up Salvatore's book, Socialist States and the Environment, Lessons for an Eco-Socialist Future, which I will pitch for Salvatore because this is something that I like to do, but Salvatore doesn't, so I'll do it for him. Like you said, Sina, listeners might be familiar with me. I know that we've recorded something in the past together about translation, actually, which is kind of going to relate to the conversation today, but I'm Henry Hakamäki. I'm one of the co-hosts of Guerrilla History. I'm a recovering scientist, currently an educator. Of course, I have long roots in the activist realm, and also I translated and edited this Stalin History and Critique of a Black Legend book by Losurdo alongside Salvatore, which is going to be the topic that we're going over today. But like, that's basically it about me. I'm really not the most interesting person in the world. I teach, I host a podcast, which
a very good
you can
podcast.
Relate to. Like, I appreciate it. And, we did this book together, but we've got another book in the works right now.
You've already moved on, but tease that. We can tease that.
We'll tease that. Maybe we'll get a little bit more towards it at the end.
So, okay. So, well, you did a better job hosting this episode than I did because you announced the subject matter of this book because I wanted to kind of
apologize.
Tease it a little bit, but it's going to be in the title of the show, but some people don't look at the titles, so it'll be surprised. But we're here to talk about, I guess we're here to talk about the translation that you guys have just released of Dominico Losurdo, Italian Marxist, recently passed away a few years ago, I think. Legendary Italian Marxist, the sort of preeminent figure in, author of dozens of books, right? And his book, one of these books that hasn't been available in translation, and we should talk about that, why, is called Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend, right? And so you guys can, first of all, congratulations on translating this book. This must have been, we'll talk about the actual translation work, but this must have been like the hair-pulling nightmare that like translations of like older books are because of editions and stuff. But I have to like commend this work. It reads beautifully, so that means you guys did an excellent job. It's a very tight packed book. It's actually like I was saying this in our earlier, is that actually the form of the book I really like too. like it's kind of, it's like, you know, the chapters themselves are sort of like divided into little sort of units, and from that you get an interesting, it's almost like he goes through, like he does this like repetitive thing of, I mean, you guys can explain it better than me obviously, but Losurdo kind of like parries with this kind of like long standing, like widespread opinion about this man, this very influential figure in the history of 20th century, like global 20th century. First of all, forget the history of like the USSR, forget the history of communism, but the history of the 20th century of humanity is, this man's name is on it. And you realize like the extent to which the investment has been made to ensure that a very specific and extremely highly negative image of this man has been erected and sustained, and that there's like generations of labor behind this. But that's too soon for that conversation. I want to say, tell me, well, actually it's not, it's the same part of the conversation, because that's part of the story of how you guys started this project. So can you say who Dominic Losurdo was for people who might not know him, and what brought you to bring this book out in English, and why hadn't it been available before? A lot of his works are, which kind of begs the question.
Salvatore, I'll let you take the who was Losurdo part, and then I'll start with the why this book part.
So yeah, that makes sense, I suppose, in terms of how our division of labor has turned out, which I think was one of the best divisions of labor I've ever experienced in a long time. Thanks to Henry. I want to thank Henry, besides for publicizing my work, and that's very kind of him, but also for having included me in this effort at translating the book. Domenico Losurdo, and by the way, Henry is grossly underestimating what he's doing, which is extremely important in terms of political education of so many people who are misled with respect to socialism and communism in particular. So thank you for doing all that work. Domenico Losurdo, I'm not a biographer of Losurdo, but from what I've understood over the years, he was a philosopher, a historian of philosophy, and also a historiographer, meaning like a historian who looks at the evolution of the methods employed and developed in the field of history. And certainly he was up to his neck in ideological struggle, principally in an Italian context and within the communist movement in Italy. He was a foremost figure in Hegelian studies, and I think he was the director of the Hegelian Studies or Hegelian Study Association. I can't remember the exact name. And he was very much involved also in fighting a lot of misleading or disinforming kinds of activities within not just philosophy and history, but also in the wider public. So he was an influential figure beyond academia. And he also was involved, I think, or at least appreciated in Gramscian circles, which there is... I mean, if anybody knows about sort of the institutes of devoted to Gramsci, you might know that there are some tensions with respect to the interpretation of Gramsci and who stands for what. But that's kind of besides the point. But Losurdo, regrettably, he was in the middle of working on a book that was not finished. That is this one, La Questione Comunista, the communism question. And that has not been translated, as far as I know, into English yet. We'll try to have something to undo that problem. And
hint, wink, wink.
Exactly. And it's unfortunate. It's an unfinished work, but it's a valuable, I guess, example of the trajectory that he was following before his untimely death in 2018. So perhaps, I don't know, maybe we can add some bits and pieces of biographical character later on, but that's maybe as far as I should go if I don't want to bore at least one part of the audience. And one of the things as well, and I just want to also emphasize that this critical juncture, Sina, thank you. Also, I'm also trying to distract myself. For those of in the audience or the listening audience who are not seeing what I'm wearing, it's a jersey of Palestino Club from Chile, and they recently won their last match, and they went out on the pitch um, 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 showing their support for the Palestinian struggle. It's one of those few moments of pride in the Americas at this moment. In North America, it's particularly heinous a situation, as many of us I know. In any case, thank you for reminding us of that, and I'll try not to, I guess, break down in tears. It's just it's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment. I know that on Guerrilla History, we've already recorded 4 episodes related to the situation in Palestine, with another one coming up after we wrap up here. So, listeners, if you don't listen to Guerrilla History, we've already released one of those, and the other 4, 5, 6, 7 that we have in the works will be coming out very shortly. So, if you're interested in the discussion on Palestine.
And that's an example of the importance of your work, Henry, as well. This is especially at this juncture.
It's heavy. So this is like you mentioned, this is a welcome distraction that we're talking about this and not that, because that's all I've been doing for the last 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks.
I sort of I veered in that, I guess, in the direction that I was not intended, because I wanted to also emphasize that Losurdo was involved in pro-Palestine efforts as well in Italy. He was always on the correct side as well. I just wanted to emphasize that, because people might not know. I think there's a YouTube video where he goes at length at explaining the atrocities committed on Palestinians by the Zionist state. So
he brings up Ben Gurion. He brings up Ben Gurion, like one of the few people who actually hold the real Zionists for like what they said and did. And I imagine, but then let's continue to the point of, so his books in translation though have been available for a long time, right? He's not some minor figure in like sort of an obscure character, right? He's been available as part of a canon of specifically sort of Italian Marxist thinkers. Like the Marxist tradition of Italy is long and rich, and he's one of these keystone figures in that. And so, not surprisingly, a lot of his books are available. You can read them. I read chunks. I can't remember. It was a long time ago. It was grad school. But this book, can you tell where it stands in his oeuvre in translation, and sort of where it comes from in his career? Where is it situated in the stages of his career? I mean.
So this was a rather late work of his. I mean, he was working all the way up to his untimely death, as Salvatore mentioned. He still has unfinished works. He was also undertaking a project on China at the time of his death. So, he has a long, decades-long career of different works of various topics, philosophical and historical in nature. And just, to mention that he's not some fringe figure. I was talking with my friend Emmanuel Ness earlier today, actually, and he's a big fan of Losurdo. He called him the leading philosopher of our time, which, may strike some people as being a bit, grandiose or something along those lines. But when you look at the body of work that he's put out and how consequential that work has been, especially if you're somebody that's coming from like a more Marxist-Leninist, left. You don't have to be Marxist-Leninist yourself, but, in that direction, he really would be one of the most consequential philosophers in the last couple of decades, really. And it would be hard to dispute that unless you were somebody who was philosophically opposed to his ideological position. But in terms of what's available in English, as you mentioned, there's a rather rich amount of work of his available in English already. This is not like this is the first book of Losurdo's that's come out in English. He has 40 or 50 books in Italian, but he has some books that are in English published by relatively major presses that have been rather successful. His book, Liberalism, A Counter History, is one that's quite popular. It's one of Verso Press is, one of their better selling, like heavy philosophy books. War and Revolution is another one that they've published that's quite popular. He has a book on Nietzsche that's been translated into English and is also quite consequential. There's others, and I know that there's more coming out. Western Marxism will be coming out in the near future as well, which is one that I'm really looking forward to. Had previously been published.
Are they all published? Are they all published by the same publisher or different ones?
No, some of them have been published by different. Verso, I think, has two. 1804 Books is coming out with the Western Marxism one. The Nietzsche one might have been Brill, but I don't remember for sure. But the other ones are from other publishers.
Actually, the Western Marxism is going to come with from Monthly Review Press, if I remember.
Monthly Review Press, that's right.
Yeah.
Apologies for that error. But in any case, to situate this work then, so I guess we'll talk about how this work came to be, because that might help us understand a little bit more about, how it relates to other works that have been available in English. So a few years ago, it had come to my attention that there was a book by Losurdo that was on Stalin. And at that time, I was kind of under the false impression that it was a biography of Stalin. But regardless, I was interested. And so, like many people, I'm sure, I was wondering why this book by this philosopher who had many books that had already been published into English and were relatively renowned within the left, why there would be a book on Stalin that wasn't translated, because Stalin is kind of a topic that, a lot of people would want to read about, like even more so than some of his other topics that he's written about. So it just seems like from an economic perspective that the presses would want to publish this book because, it's a topic that people are interested in. And so what I did, this is probably 3 years ago now, I sent an email into Verso Books.
I remember
I'll just call them out by name. I mean, before I was saying like an unnamed press, but whatever. It's Sebastian Budgeon.
I think I've been blacklisted by Verso for a while now. I don't care. We can say their name.
I mean, there are certainly books that come out from Verso that are quite good and quite important, including books by Losurdo. But, anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is I sent this email in a couple years ago, and very politely I asked them, hey, do you have any plans on publishing the Losurdo Stalin book? Because, I know you've published at least 2 of his other books, and there's another one that they've been promising for forever, the Bonapartism book. That was supposed to come out 2 years ago, and then they delayed it to last year, and then it's been delayed again. So in theory, Verso's still going to be putting out a Losurdo book on Bonapartism, but, as of yet, it hasn't come out. So I emailed them. I said, you've put out a couple of books. I know that they've sold well for you. I know that you have more books that are in the works right now from the Losurdo estate. Is there any plans on publishing the Stalin book at any time in the near future? That was basically it. And the person who I emailed, just, the front desk worker was like, oh, that's a great question. I'll forward it along to my managing editor. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. Like, I'll get an answer at least. And the answer that came back, I got an answer. The answer from Sebastian Budgeon, again, I'll call him out by name because he's just, Trotskyist extraordinaire.
It's who he is. Whatever. It's what he wrote. I'll put the email. I'll put a screenshot of the email here. You just send it.
Go ahead. Yeah. I'll have to find it. I have it on Twitter.
I'll use it as the episode art.
Great. Yeah. I put a side by side when the book came out, the email versus like the cover of our translation on Twitter. But in any case, he sends this hyper like almost insulting email back, like, none of you people
Sebastian
that think
Budgeon insulting. I'm
shocked. Who
shocked.
would have thought? But yeah, he sends this thing back like, if there was any intellectual merit in this work, we would do it. But you people that are clamoring for this work, you need to grow up and, like, forget that idea because that's never going to happen. We're never going to publish that. And it's like, whoa, like, all you had to say was, no, we don't plan on it. Like, people have emailed presses before asking, is a book going to be published? And the answer has been no before. People understand that. But it was the aggression. He wanted you to share
that email. He wanted you to share
it. And that was the funny thing. If you look on Twitter, Sebastian doesn't have a Twitter account himself, but, obviously he's got eyes. So I put that email out on Twitter just like, hey, look, here was my very polite question, and here's the response I got. And it was like my first viral tweet. I had like 600 followers at that time or something like that.
I was one of those followers.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear it. So I put that out there. And, it kind of gets some traction. Like 20 minutes later, I get another email from him. How dare you put this email onto Twitter? I said, if you would have said no, I wouldn't have put it out there. If you acted like an actual human being, I would have treated you like one. But, you're going to do that? Well, you suffer the consequences. I don't care. So, I guess this is why I don't fit in academia. I am not an academic myself. So, because I am petty like that. In any case, so shortly thereafter, after we have this spat between Sebastian Budgen and myself via email, which I still find quite humorous, I was reached out to by Ben Stank at Iskra Books, the imprint of the Center for Communist Studies. And he said, Henry, I know that you're interested in this book. We're publishing translations from our press, and it's like open access, nonprofit press. They make all the PDFs available for free. Like, you are interested in this. Would you consider doing the translation for us? And I was like, okay, not knowing what I was getting myself into. So that was kind of the origin of it, because I own several other of Losurdo's books, and I really wanted to have this book available in English. And so when somebody said, hey, why don't you do it? I said, oh, okay. It became very evident very quickly that was not going to be possible for me to do by myself. But fortunately, I am very good friends with a native Italian speaker. And we had recently had a conversation, like just a couple months before that, we had a conversation where I called him out on negatively portraying Stalin. And he agreed with me that his portrayal of Stalin was kind of colored by the way that Stalin is portrayed within the West. And so I reached out to this friend of mine and said, hey, Salvatore, you interested in joining in on this project? And of course, as you see, Salvatore was interested in joining in this project. And really, it wouldn't have been possible without him. So over the next year and a half, it was not a very quick project. Over the next year and a half.
That's not slow for a translation like this. That's not slow. That's like, well, translations take years. They're hard. They're not like
it was
immense
hard,
amount of labor.
Yeah, I'm happy that we got it. So that was the kind of the end of the story, is that Salvatore joined. Everything went swimmingly from there on, hard work, but it really went smoothly, to be honest with you. And, here we are. The book's published. People are reading it. I'm getting all the time people are writing in and saying that they're finding the book really useful, not just in terms of Stalin himself, but also useful more broadly, which to me is actually the much more interesting and much more useful part of the book, is not on Stalin the figure, but is in terms of the phenomenon that we're talking about in this book, which I'm sure we'll get into in the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, we can get into it now, because it's a book about historiography, right? Like it's not a history book. It's not like the way that we think of genres of academic writing, and it's kind of tied to the profession itself and sort of like the shape of monographs and stuff. That this book, I would say, I mean, you guys read it much closer than I did. I mean, we talked about this, Henry, in our episode, that like translation is like the closest kind of reading. So you two know this book, I'm sure, inside and out, and its format. But the nature of it seems to be, it's a work of historiography. So he's reading the readings of Stalin and the assessments of Stalin. So it's like and actually this was like one of the things that I loved in my academic career, is that I say this, like I didn't really like literature, but I liked literary criticism a lot more. Like I liked the analysis and the synthesis. And the literature itself, maybe that was my problem, that like the literature itself was whatever. Like, oh, it's nice, Dickens, that's great. That makes me feel happy reading this sentence. But it was more the sort of like the work of a critical reader that I was interested in, and how they synthesized, say, an author's work or a generation of authors or a series of authors into a compressed reading, and how they augmented that reading, or let's say refracted that reading through a literary or historical archive of lesser known books. And this is just standard like literary work, right? Now, I personally think that historiographical work is not all that different, that it is a kind of criticism. It is a kind of literary criticism. Now, sure, like judging by the footnotes, there is a kind of like archival project attached to this, but it doesn't feel the way Like it doesn't feel, and he was like a senior, he was like a pretty advanced guy when he wrote this. So he's past that stage of your career where you have to kind of establish your bona fides and, you know, the things that like historians have to do, like a lot of academics, like here's this tiny little corner and go map it out in all of its immense detail. And then we'll let you do something bigger. Then we'll let you sort of take on something more ambitious. But so this is a work of, my best way of saying it is that it's a critical, it's kind of literary critical history of this manufacturing of a black legend. Now we should talk about that title a little later. I understand the Italian, but go ahead.
I think that the way that you portrayed it is very accurate. The way that I've been categorizing it is that this is not a history book, and the listeners need to understand that this is not a history book. Again, when it was first presented to me that this book existed, I was kind of under the auspices that it was a biography, and then I thought that it was more of a history. No, it's neither of those things, actually. There's almost no biography of Stalin at all. And the history is like used to kind of flavor what's going on rather than being the point of the book. What I call it is a historiographic media and narrative analysis. It's kind of hard to put your finger on exactly what this book is, to be honest with you. But that's the best way that I've come up with, is it's a historiographic media and narrative analysis, because that's what we're doing, is we're looking at the portrayal of Stalin and how that narrative was then constructed over time.
Yeah, it's I hadn't been thinking as thoroughly as you, Henry, about this, and thanks, also for bringing out the literary criticism angle, because it does resonate with me as well now. Thinking about it with you all. Losurdo himself would characterize his work as like a history, sort of a dialectical and historical materialism take on the development of ideas, or in this case, mythologies. But I think that the way that you describe it, Henry, seems much more close to the mark to me. I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah, because he brings in a lot of not just historiography, but also media representations. Well, maybe not a lot of media representations, but I think that part of it is like newspapers and are included as well as part of how the construct of Stalin has been built up since especially 56. Anyway.
So, I mean, we should just get into it, because there is that part of the story too, is that the Soviet Union, or at least a faction within the Soviet Union, was a key player in the weaving of this black legend. So, like, you know, if you're an anti-communist, like, dude sitting in West Virginia, I just want to be left alone with my Bud Lights, and you present this to me, it's like, well, they themselves said he was a cult of personality. They themselves said this. Like, what am I supposed to like not believe them? So like, it's an interesting that I would say that like the key collaborators in this story are like parts of the Soviet apparatus itself, the Soviet apparatus that Stalin erected or helped erect, that like the Stalin era was instrumental in erecting, right? Because part of the story here is that like and this is common, it's a kind of Orientalist thing too. It's a kind of bourgeois historians, you know, little sleight of hand, is that they collapse the man with the state and the form of governance altogether, right? That it's easy for them to, and it's to this day, they do it. Oh, Assad bad. Let's support Israel destroying Syria. Like that, those like chain of thoughts. It's like, oh, you collapse the bad guy that you don't like for whatever reason. You don't like him, so then that reflects backwards onto the state itself, because he's just a stand-in for the state. And then that reflects badly on Arab socialism, because that's what this came all out of. And that ultimately reflects on the people who support him. So we can, you know, send our right-wing fascist, like, you know, like Salafi psychos to like drive trucks over like Syrian soldiers, you know, like, and film it and like share it, right? Like that chain of events begins with an act of collapsing the Syrian state with this man. And I think you realize that like, oh, the holy grail of this is with Stalin. Like that's where they perfected this skill. I mean, maybe you could say like, okay, yeah, the idea of like great men of history, that this has been like a constant bourgeois fixation, and it's pre-capitalist too, right? Like Roman historians, like, you know, like this is not like a new thing. But the inverse of that is, and this is the new thing, I would say, is like manufacturing these like amazing sort of dictatorial villains, right? Like Hannah Arendt and her like totalitarianism that like in the Soviet Union congealed all of the forms of like Asiatic, like despotism and sort of like Eurasian like wildness, like everything. And you realize that it all just Stalin is the guy, is like the source, and like what they learned on kind of practicing on the memory of him and his era, supposedly, that they've now they practice that on all of their bad figures, right? That like, and then they just, so like like I remember once meeting like a Ukrainian person here, and she was like, yeah, it was like Soviet fascism that blah blah blah, and I was like, wait, Soviet fascism? So the people who fought fascism and died in like the tens of millions, they're actually also they're the same thing. Like, and it's so common to think like that here. It's just such a common thing, and you realize that it like begins with this project around this guy. Like, do people talk about Lenin this way? Is Lenin seems like like only Leninists talk about Lenin, it seems. Like whereas the whole Stalin is like, Stalin himself seems to be this kind of like, I don't know. I mean, you guys say it in the intro well, that like it becomes a keyword for everything bad, everything bad. And so anyways, we should get into that part of it.
Before we even get into that, just one thing that you said, people don't talk about Lenin all that often. It's really funny. I don't know if the listeners know, I live in Russia, which, people are going to turn off this interview now because Henry lives in Russia. But okay, whatever. For those of you who are still here, they haven't turned off the episode. It's interesting.
No, my listeners aren't that lame. Come on, they're here.
No, I know. I have faith in your listeners.
The tankiest of all the tanky podcasts, proudly.
I know you've got tanky group therapy. I know. I listen to it all the time. Anyway. No, it's funny that you bring up Lenin, though, because if you look in Russia, Lenin is much more present in society still in terms of visually. So you go around, you see Lenin statues all over the place. Like even still, actually not in St. Petersburg so much, but in the cities that are away from kind of those two Western capitals. I live in Kazan. We've got multiple Lenin statues. We've got a huge one right in the middle of Victory Square, and we've got also a statue to young Lenin outside of the university here, where it was the first university he went to, and it's the only statue of young Lenin, the only statue of Lenin with hair, let's put it that way, in Russia at this point. And he's got memorial houses all over the place. There's still things named after him. Stalin, not so much. You don't see statues of Stalin, although there was one just erected yesterday in a children's park in Kirov Oblast. So anyway, that's neither here nor there. There's a couple more that have actually popped up in the last 2 years, really, but Stalin is not so visually present within Russia. But when they do polling on the greatest leaders in Russian and Soviet history, it's really interesting because Lenin and Stalin are still both seen extremely positively. They're like net positive in terms of favorable versus unfavorable is very strong for both of them. But the undecided for Lenin is also relatively large, whereas for Stalin, it is not. Everybody has an opinion for Stalin strongly one way or the other. And in Russia in particular, which is the opposite of in the West, it is very strong. He has the third highest approval rating of any Russian or Soviet leader in history. The only ones that have a higher net approval rating are Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. That's it.
Wow. He's more popular than Vladimir Putin?
Yes, in this poll, yes.
Wow.
He has the third highest net approval rating of any leader. Let that sink in. Any leader in Russian or Soviet history. That's pre-Soviet Russia, Soviet Union period, and post-Soviet Russia. Stalin has the third highest net approval rating, and it's like plus 42%. It's huge. So for me, it's interesting, that we talk about how people don't talk about Lenin. Here you see Lenin, but even when people are talking about their strong opinions on things, they still have the strong opinions about Stalin, but it's kind of the opposite of what you hear in the West. And just as another anecdote, somebody that's kind of tangentially related to my workplace, which, as I said, I'm an educator. So not somebody that works with me, but somebody that I communicate with as a result of being at work. He saw my name on the front of this book, and I'm thinking, oh God, this person that has some bearing on my job is seeing my name on the cover of a book with Stalin on it. It's not an explicitly. And this person is rather well off as well. So if it was somebody in, Russian society that would have a negative, I'm thinking, oh man, I'm in trouble now. Like, I'm a foreigner. I don't have permanent residency yet. Like I've got a big problem. The person sends me a message on Telegram and is like, Henry, I see that you translated a book about Stalin. Here it comes. And he's like, I think that Stalin is used as a stand-in for Western imperialists to beat Russians and beat socialism. I was like, this is the point of the book. Like, hey, you got it. You didn't even have to read it. You know the message. So anyway, that's like a little anecdote. Salvatore, I've been rambling too long. Go ahead, but that was just my little story.
Well, it's fascinating. Maybe no wonder Putin wants to besmirch Lenin. He doesn't dare do anything about Stalin's, as a figure historically, right? I suppose. Let's see. Where were we at with respect to the process of constructing the image of Stalin? Perhaps we could go back also to the question you posed, about the title. And which does not sound exactly clever in English, and perhaps we could have had a more back and forth about it. But it was we wanted to be as faithful to the original language as possible. The term Black Legend does not resonate in the same way in Italy, and so as you well know, I'm sure part of the problem with translation is you cannot immerse the reader in the entire cultural context from which the language within which the language exists. It would have in hindsight, perhaps you could have found a different title. I have no idea. I've been thinking about it and
maybe
thinking about
dark.
it. I don't know.
Maybe
dark legend. But even that, I'm thinking Malcolm X, and so
So I live with someone who speaks Italian.
My condolences.
and I'm subjected to a lot of, I can't believe I'm admitting this, I'm subjected to a lot of Italian soap operas every day. Well, one Italian soap opera every day. So I've noticed also, and also like Italian TV shows, and so I see Italian script enough, and I have noticed that and it's the same thing with German too, with Schwarz, how it's used as a metaphor for darkness, how dark and black is submerged together. Now, of course, is that drowning in the history of European racism? Obviously, but because like blackness is this thing that pulls together all parts of the world as this bad thing, right? But part of it is that he did use that title on purpose, and it's like he used it to say that it was like this rendering of this guy as this almost, like otherworldly figure, right? Who represents like the kind of hordes of like Asiatic. I mean, this like the Ukrainian war has brought this all out to the fore. Liberals are trotting it all out. So he did sort of like, I figured he did that on purpose. And like an Italian boomer isn't gonna like think like Black Legend, that kind of sounds weird in English. Like he won't like say that to himself. So like I see your dilemma of like, do you the fidelity to the original text versus like like the sensibilities of us as English people. So I did want to sort of ask that question at the beginning. But can we talk about the actual, like there's a great metaphor he used. I mean, I will say it again. I said it already and I said it before our chat. Like it's a beautifully written book. Beautifully. Like the chapter, like the essays flow between each other, and they are like, you wouldn't know it, but it's like an academic study, right? Like he's studying other academics and what they say, and he corresponds them to the historical record, and he compares it, and then he raises bigger questions about contextualization, and he does what academics do. But the way that he handles it, and I feel that like even just the breaking up of the chapters and kind of the movement of the arguments, and it kind of zooms out, and it is basically temporal, but also it's thematic. So it's a masterful text constructed, and the work that it must have taken to piece together the things. I'm curious. I mean, this is too early for this, but I still want to ask, what was the work process like for you two? How did you divide it?
Well, Henry really took upon himself the bulk of the work at first. There wasn't well, Henry you should talk about this more than I, because you were the one initiating it. I just wanted to mention that David Peat was also involved in streamlining the translation, catching things that didn't quite work out in English as well. So we had multiple eyes on this. But Henry, would you like to discuss
Sure. So
the initial
yeah, just
process at least? Yeah.
Yeah, and thanks for mentioning David. So David Peat was our main editor at Iskra Books, the publisher. So when we were going through the process, he was checking it and asking very good questions, both like philosophical questions as well as, hey, this word doesn't quite make sense here. Can you either explain it in a footnote or find an alternative word for it? And so that was really helpful. And thanks to David, the book wouldn't have been nearly as good without his input. So there's that. But here's the thing that's going to probably, catch a few listeners off, is that my Italian is wretched. Like, I know very, very little Italian. So people might be saying, well, how does Henry get involved in this project? So I was working with some machine learning translation stuff and kind of tinkering around with it to optimize it for this project specifically. And I was basically doing the like grunt work so that Salvatore's process would hopefully be easier. And I hope that it was, not
super absolutely,
challenging
Henry.
for you.
Yeah, no,
but
it was so much easier.
I was feeding it into the machine learning software that I was kind of optimizing, like paragraph by paragraph, and then proofreading the paragraph and trying to make it read in English as if an actual human wrote it. And then also cross-referencing it with the existing translation, which, just to mention, it was a freelance translation done by the late David Ferreira based on the Spanish and Portuguese editions of the book. So a translation of a translation. And commendable effort and, well done on, like I said, the late David Ferreira for taking the project onto himself and then, going through that of trying to figure out how to put this translation of a translation together and then putting it up on various places on the internet available for free. It wasn't exactly legal the way that it was done, and there was a lot of inherent flaws with the process of that translation. Just the fact that it was a translation of a translation was going to limit it in many ways. And there was no publisher behind us and no proofreading and et cetera, et cetera. So if you look at that other translation, you will see quite a few discrepancies between theirs and ours translation. So I was feeding the thing in paragraph by paragraph, reading it, cross-referencing it, especially for the citations, in-text citations and whatnot. And then when I had it to a point where it was like, okay, this seems like what it should be in English, then I would send it to Salvatore for the final translation proofing, side-by-side comparison, making sure that all of, the idioms were coming across in a way that made sense to English-speaking readers, because as you mentioned, Sina, a lot of these things just culturally don't make sense. I know my wife is from Crimea. She's, Crimean Tatar. And so when we watch things that are Russian, old Soviet movies and things like that, we have to pause every couple of minutes. So she's like, yeah, this joke, it means this because like there's an expression in Russian that goes like that. And it's ha ha ha, I get the joke. But then on the other hand, same thing happens in English. Her English is better than mine, but we still have to pause because I have to explain cultural things. So, that's how it is. And so Salvatore was looking for all of this, making sure that there was no terrible errors in my, kind of machine learning based translation. So Salvatore really takes most of the credit for how this translation reads, because while I did the bulk translation over the course of like 9 months, because like I said, it was paragraph by paragraph and then cross-referencing. Like it was the grunt work. It wasn't the like polishing of the project, which Salvatore gets all of the credit for, as well as David at the publisher, David Peat.
As usual, Henry's too much. It's too much modesty there. Without that primary work, I would not have been able to focus on the polishing at all. I would have had to worry about so many other details that. Because of my own schedule, I would get a little pedantic and whingy about it as well. So the patience that Henry and David had with me is also something that I appreciated. I would go line by line, of course, just like Henry did as well, and also compare it to the existing translation and along with the original in Italian. And yeah, it was it was arduous and I suppose I think you've already pointed this out, Sina. This is it's a huge undertaking, and but because it was so rewarding in the end, and maybe we'll touch upon that much beyond our expectations, how rewarding it was in the end. We're willing to self-flagellate again for another translation. The process, once I was done and David went over it again, that then the formatting, typographical setting and all that was, I think, done by, I'm not sure if it was David and Ben.
I think
together.
David was mostly doing the citations, making sure the citations lined up, and then Ben was making the Ben Stanka, again at Iskra Books, was doing the physical, making sure it looked nice on the pages, and then he also designed the cover and all of the the things like that. So credit to Ben as well.
Yeah, it's just I find it now that we're actually speaking about it, I was saying before, it's probably one of the best experiences in the division of labor that sort of was most effective in terms of exploiting each other's most I guess most developed skills in different components of doing the work. And so for me, it was also a pleasure at the same time that it was a pain. I have to admit that going line by line after a while, it's not. Fortunately, it's not the first time I've done this. I've translated ages ago a work by the late Antonio Santucci, a biography of Gramsci, and that was also a very painstaking process. I should.
Biographies have a lot of proper nouns, and those are like a pain in the ass because you have to, because it's a hard collecting all those things. Yeah, no, the work of translation here, I'm fascinated listening to all this.
Proper nouns in this book as well, because they change a lot in Italian. So
of course,
and of course it went from Russian in many of the cases, Russian, which has transliteration.
Exactly.
So then we had to transliterate from Russian into Italian, and then translate the Italian noun usage into English. So that was I tried to do as much of that as possible, because I know that would have made Salvatore's hair fall out.
Well, it has already, so
listeners of the episode won't get it.
No, exactly.
They won't get it, but we do it. That's okay.
I don't exactly have a full set of hair on my head, but maybe an analogy
Stalin
would be...
took it from you.
Absolutely, look at that. Oh, good. Let's not get started yet on that. I guess I should say brain fluids were coming out of my ears. Would have been an analogy.
It's hard work. It's unless you've done literary translation, you will never know the amount of backbreaking, just head mashing against your table, because ultimately, I think I said this in our episode, that it's not about the source language, it's about the target language. Mm-hmm. That's the goal. It's like it's not. I could read an Italian sentence and get most of it, even though I don't speak Italian. Maybe, I learned French, even if my French is rusty as hell, but I know English really well.
But you have the Italian opera advantage. It's soap opera advantage. That's it.
Yeah, well, that too, yeah. I've heard so many things. I was like, oh, that's how they do their relative clauses. That's how they, because once you learn the sort of system, especially Romance languages, they're not, let's be real, guys, these aren't exactly complicated syntax.
No.
It's pretty straightforward. My lesson was my first foreign language, really immersive, learning was with Arabic and formal Arabic and case inflection. And then I was that's a little hard. I'm going to go to German now. And so it was the same problem, right? But I realized, at least in German, you can move the parts of the sentence of the sentence around. And that was something for me that I always loved doing. That's how I learned German. I would sit and translate books that I was reading, and it was fun for me. It was better than any course that I could ever take. I did have to take some courses to kind of get to that level, and I was living there, so I was immersed in the language. I would see ads. So I did have a weird thing, but ultimately translation for me is the best way to learn a language. And it is a kind of like, it's almost like a religious reading of a text because you're so close to it. But we should actually talk about the text itself, because the manufacturing of this legend is a fascinating process in what might be like a worldwide, I don't want to say conspiracy, but let's say a kind of like I don't want to say sideshow, but almost like a it's almost as if we're forced to live in this kind of like upside down universe where like the violence of bourgeois European states and their settler offspring, the immense violence that is ongoing to this day, literally right now, the immense violence of the bourgeois like European white supremacist state is taking place right now. I mean, not just in the US and whatever, but literally in Palestine and its offshoot in its Zionist colony. Like, there is so much drenched in violence, and you're convinced the role of this like intellectual apparatus that's like decades old at this point, that like multiple generations in, that has all kinds of like belligerents, right, from around the world that they find. Ukrainian anti-communist, Cuban anti-communist, like Iranian anti-communist, you know, like Japanese anti-communist, and they have this almost like congealed mass of human beings who all kind of repeat the same line: Soviet Union bad, Soviet Union bad, Soviet Union evil, right? And you like wonder, like, if it was that bad, would it have lasted as long as it was? Now, the US has lasted a hell of a lot longer than the Soviet Union ever did, right? Like 4 times or 3 times the length, at least, whatever, if you want to talk about its existence. But like, I'm just curious that like one of these sort of sleight of hands that this thing has affected us, at least here in the global north, that all of us are kind of products of, the education system, I mean, is that, oh yeah, like the USSR was this abomination and we were on the winning side of the Cold War, right? And so I mean, Henry, you and I are basically the same age. I don't know how old you are, Salvatore.
No, I'm much younger than you, Sina. Just so you know.
Oh, really? I think we're how much? I don't know how old you are, but like we're.
You just turned 40, didn't you?
Yeah.
I'm 28.
I'm afraid I'm the oldest.
Wow, wow, you're a baby. But you know this. Well, you know
I don't
this,
look
though,
it,
is that
but I am.
Yeah, we were raised in like the the neoliberal pride and like just drunken Pax, like their Pax Americana of like, we won the Cold War. So like we are products of that, and we're taught the like good things about the fall of the Soviet Union, like, oh, Romania, like the death of Ceausescu, like these are moments of pride for like a certain class of not just academics but journalists, you know, teachers teach this in high school. Like there is a full-blown effort to assure that every person who like lives today knows that the Soviet Union was totalitarian and Stalin was its greatest figure, in the negative way, that he's like their greatest product. And those two are the same. And if you don't carry water, if you like don't denounce that, then you're somehow a Stalinist. And that's like the manufacture of the Stalinist might be a good place, because that's a great chapter.
I'll let Salvatore answer this first, but I just want to say one thing for the listeners to keep in mind as Salvatore answers this, which is that as we're thinking about, you know, how this happened, why this happened, in terms of this construction of this narrative around Stalin, and then the usage of this narrative around Stalin to beat socialists and communists with, which is, I mean, kind of the ultimate goal here, is that there is an ideological project that is the foundation for the necessity to create this narrative with geopolitical goals. So like this decision by which this project is undertaken, and the ways in which the project is undertaken of creating this narrative and then utilizing this manufactured narrative around Stalin, is because there is an ideological basis for this project, and it has geopolitical goals that then were in mind at the end of this creation. So just listeners, keep that in the back of your mind, but I'll turn it over to Salvatore now, because I've been talking quite a bit and Salvatore is much smarter than me.
Doubtful. No, thanks, Henry, for taking that on. And um, the interesting part, I mean, that is the analysis in the book by Losurdo is about how the figure of Stalin markedly was markedly shifted by actually even before the so-called not so secret Khrushchev speech, and that just to add a little bit to that, I don't think Losurdo mentions it, I don't recall, but with respect to the geopolitical processes at play. I mean, this is when you have the atomic bombs, unleashed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, basically, which was a warning to the USSR, and so it already starts. The material conditions precede the ideological manufacturing, I think, in this respect, or at least one could think about it that way. But then again, I'm reading much more into Losurdo's text, and so people should check out how Losurdo brings out the sharp change that is not exactly sudden, but becomes almost univocal about Stalin after the Khrushchev speech. So beforehand, I mean, it wasn't too long before that speech that you had accolades from almost any quarter in Western Europe and North America about Stalin, and because obviously Stalin played a pivotal role in defeating Nazi Germany, and that was kind of undeniable and was part of the Allies, so it would have made very little sense to create a negative figure of Stalin when it was inconvenient. And in any case, it was not exactly a linear development, because one might remember that in the US, for example, in the 20s, there was the persecution of communists and anarchists, anyone on the left. And so you already had a precursor to, I guess, if you like, a very well-oiled media machinery that had worked already as a charm, especially in settler colonial context. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, yeah, to put it much more succinctly. So you already had precedents for that, and I don't remember whether Losurdo puts that in the book. I thought he did, but then again, I haven't looked at the line by line since then, and I've had too many line by lines of other books. But yeah, and well, it's just so much I can fit in my head. Anyway, but it wasn't a linear process. So you would basically, there was a kind of a wait and see as well, ideological tactic in terms of Stalin, and then when there were because I think there were ideological splits anyway within the ruling classes in the UK, in the US, for example, in terms of supporting the fascists and the Nazis or not. It wasn't a singular process. It gets unified certainly by the mid to late 40s. That's what Losurdo traces, and then of course there's the hand of the Western left at this as well, which is very unfortunate. Shall we say that much of the Western left seems to be unaware of its historical context when it mouths off about socialist currents or communist currents that they don't like, and that's a recurring problem. And Losurdo kind of touches on this. Not so directly as much as, for example, someone by the name of Azzara, who's I think a historian, who's written actually some biographical some sort of biography, very short biography of Losurdo, but really centered on Losurdo's work. Sort of points out that one of the things that would have been good to see would have been a little bit more about the leftist currents contributing to the problem. But one of the things that I think you were raising in some respects, I mean, it's not a conspiracy. In fact, it doesn't have to be a conspiracy because they have the same interest, these ruling classes, right? So it's a convergence of interests. And so long as that convergence of interest has a material basis to continue, Stalin will continue to have serve as the trope of massive evil that is, of course, equated with Hitler or Genghis Khan. Like I was just listening to a podcast by a well-known historian from Piemonte, my region of birth, who was for some reason like touches on Stalin. It's like completely gratuitous on a completely different topic. It was about 1954 and the Belgian elections, and I was like, instead of recalling that the leader of the Belgian Communist Party was assassinated, he just goes off into like talking about using the German word Lager, the concentration camp under Stalin. I was like, we're still on this. It's 2023. We could talk about Gaza as one of the, if not the largest concentration camp in the world, but no, right? So this is how, it's an example, maybe anecdotal, but of how important it still is to make sure that the figure of Stalin, this is the importance of Losurdo's work, is to demonstrate how important the figure of Stalin, not Stalin himself, but how important the figure of Stalin, the mythology constructed around Stalin in the NATO countries, of these settler colonial and imperialist countries, how important it is to make sure that people across generations will know that communism is evil and only brings Nazi-like ends. I think that's basically the point, especially now, I should suspect, when you have a resurgence of interest in socialism. And I would expect, actually, the ruling class, sort of backlash. And so Losurdo's book, but the problem is that within the Western left, you have this big problem in which they don't seem to recognize the historical conjuncture in which they live, and they actively contribute to the continuation, the reproduction of this process, which is viciously anti-communist, to say the least, or anti-socialist, anti-anything on the left, even if one wants to extend it, because I think that's the point. One more thing, though, that was coming to mind as you had mentioned some things before, and it's not coming back to me, but well, maybe we'll come back a bit later. But that's the examination. Like the first part in the book is also about the process of construction of an image of Stalin that is completely, this is the other thing. That's what I want to mention. There are a lot of fabrications out there still, and that you see online actually repeated as if they were, factually based. But people who are not exactly communist, historians who are not communist, like J.R. Getty or Pyotr Naumov, have shown empirically that a lot of the claims are at best exaggerations, if not fabrications. So Losurdo is not relying on those historians. And what's powerful about Losurdo is that actually on the basis of the very logic, the very discourse itself of these various heads of states, politicians, journalists or propagandists of various sorts, and historians, is through their discourse itself that you can show the self-contradictions, the incoherence, and so then you can say, well, if these are facts, well, then they become unfaxed later, and then they become facts another time, and it becomes obvious that this is a farce, that there's nothing, or that at the very least one has to question the validity of the image being created about Stalin. And of course, this is what I wanted to add. Now I remember, and it's thanks to Henry, I have to thank him for many things, that I questioned myself, like why did I bother, like in my own book, writing such stuff about Stalin? Why did I have that compulsion to do that? And so this is how pervasive the ideology is, that even, I mean, someone who should know better, like me, maybe shouldn't, I don't know, falls for it. And this is how pernicious it is, and this is how important this unraveling of all this ideological um, effort by ruling classes is, how important it is to fight against it. Whether one agrees with what Stalin, but it's not Stalin. And just to go back to what you were saying, Sinan, it was such an important point. I want to emphasize it again, is that what prevails even among leftists is a bourgeois view of the world, of world history, that is reduced to individual activity and actions.
And an imperialist one at that too, because it's a one based in the global north that reflects the agenda of the global north, that picks up, that uses the language of liberation to sell more imperialism. Like we've been assaulted for almost a decade and a half with these liberatory projects called the Arab Spring. And they were all used as proxies to fight dirty wars. Like that's, and like we were told that this was liberatory. We told that this was like, oh, Libya was freeing itself from the yoke of authoritarianism. And, and so like they'll use anything to like pull their agenda. And you realize that like a kind of a point where they all converge is around this one figure, this powerful figure who defeated a lot of their plans and who did a better job defeating their so-called enemies, the Nazis, than they did, and who sacrificed a lot of people. I mean, we laugh about this, but it's a very serious thing to dismiss the sacrifices of the Soviet Union.
Yes.
That like, you are doing deep violence to like the history of the 20th century in a sense, by just writing it off. Like this entire, this entire wing of the continent of Eurasia, was under this Soviet flag. The meaning of that cannot just simply dismissed as, oh, they were enslaved. Like it's as if like the whole Gulag archipelago thing just became like normal way of speaking, right? It's just like the normal way, as opposed to the fact that like hundreds of millions of people were part of this project, and hundreds of millions of people outside of the Soviet Union saw it as a guiding light. Whether you disagree with that or not doesn't matter, but that's like factually correct, that people around the world, and he shows this at the beginning, look to this guy. Now, was it the best example to cite Israel on the first page? Not so much. What are you doing, Domenico?
But it is in a way important because of the accusation of Stalin as an anti-Semite. Because this is the ridiculous thing. It's another trope that is leveled at communists, who might have maybe a critical perspective of Stalin, but are not necessarily dismissive of. And again, it's not Stalin. It's really like millions of people who were involved in making the USSR. It was hardly Stalin by himself, but this accusation of anti-Semitism, I guess maybe because of the kind of the insanity that is going on at this moment, it seems particularly important to state. I just reread recently, thanks to the work of Ghassan Kanafani, one of the most amazing Palestinian writers, historians, so many hats that he wore. But and he was cut down by Mossad. For people who don't know. He reminded me while I was reading that of the more than 2 million German Jews who fled the Nazi Germany in the 1930s, 75% went to the USSR. They did not go to the US, where they were mostly barred. They didn't go to the UK, and only 8% went to Palestine, only because they were basically goaded into it for the most part. So it's astonishing. This is during the height of so-called totalitarianism, the 1930s, and this is where Jews go to have freedom, right? That
they had their own. They still have. I mean, technically, their own oblast in Russia. There's an administrative republic of Russia called Jewish Autonomous Oblast, which the reasons for the foundation of it are like rather self-explanatory, and the history of it is actually quite interesting. And like the fact that now only about 1% of the population there is Jewish, whereas it was constructed and largely was Jewish, and there's huge synagogues there and everything like that. It's in the far east of Russia, if anybody is interested, like right on the border with China. But Salvatore is talking about anti-Semitism here and how that's relevant to today. this is like a major theme in the book for people who are interested about these claims of Stalin's anti-Semitism. I'm looking at the hardcover edition right now, but I think that the page numbers are the same in the paperback as well. Everything from 201 to 238, so 37 pages are on this specific claim. And I guess to backtrack a little bit, so I'm going to get us off of anti-Semitism for just a second, if you don't mind, and I'll let you pick that back up then, because I know that I cut you off a little bit.
Not at all. I think that's we should. I mean, it might form a sizable chunk of the book, but it's not one of the main things. So
yeah. So I just wanted to backtrack for a bit because when talking about the anti-Semitism, and there's 37 pages, and they show that a lot of these discourses about Stalin are just outright fabrications. I do want to just clarify one thing that was brought up earlier for the listeners who haven't read the book and are interested in doing so. We've been talking about fabrications and propaganda, and how if you look at the actual historical record versus what is kind of in popular discourse surrounding Stalin, many of those discursive popular accounts, even by people who in theory are academics, like Timothy Snyder and whatnot, again, in theory, academics. So sorry, I'm losing my track because Timothy Snyder, I mean, just really. Anyway, this book is not it's not a book that goes out to debunk all of these claims, which I know sometimes it's portrayed as that. Like, this is an exoneration, a full exoneration of Stalin, and it goes and it takes all of these claims about the negative sides of Stalin and debunks them point by point. That's not what this book is at all. It does point out that there are plenty of fabrications in the record of Stalin, and of course there are, but if you're looking for point-by-point refutations, look elsewhere. This isn't the book for that. It also talks about how many of the claims that were true largely are exaggerated or are used specifically for propaganda purposes. Again, largely true, but that's not the main point of this book. You can look elsewhere for other works that look at this point specifically. What this book is looking at is how and why this narrative is constructed. But, we have examples of how this propaganda works and why it happens, and how even when there are kernels of truth, how they run out of control. So I know we had mentioned the so-called Holodomor earlier, and, I'm going to get myself into I'll get myself into something.
They're not watching. They don't care.
Yeah. Well, anyway, in any case, nobody claims that there wasn't a famine. You can find the staunchest, ultra dogmatist, Stalinist. I'm a Marxist-Leninist. People would categorize me as a Stalinist, whatever. But I'm not dogmatic. I don't say he was a god. He was a man. There was mistakes. We have to acknowledge that. But there are ultra dogmatists that are they literally will say things like Stalin did not make mistakes, or Stalin did no wrong, or something like that. I've seen that. That's an incorrect line to take as well. That is not helpful for constructing a socialist future, to just not focus on things that did happen improperly, or wrongs that happened in the past. The point that I'm kind of driving towards and kind of skirting around, because I had a long day at work, and so anyway, the point is that what we see is that when there is a kernel of truth, like the fact that there was a famine, mind you, the last major famine in Soviet history, and there's something to be said for that as well, but again, neither here nor there at the moment. There was a famine, and there were areas that were disproportionately affected, particularly Kazakhstan. I know that nobody cares about Kazakhstan. We care, but people, when they talk about the famine of 1931, 1933, they talk about Ukraine. Ukraine suffered much less than Kazakhstan did in that specific famine. The same exact famine, an order of magnitude more suffering in Kazakhstan. If we want to focus on where things really went wrong, why aren't we calling this Holodomor is a Ukrainian word? Why aren't we using a Kazakh word for this famine? Yeah. Why is that? Anyway, the point that I'm driving at is that we even have a lot of the early accounts of the so-called Holodomor. Again, not denying that there was a famine, but the intentionality is what needs to be
Henry, they're
disputed
gonna care. They're gonna hate you no matter what you say. You
no,
don't.
I
have
know.
to,
I'm
like,
just being honest here, Sina. Like,
but it's true.
there was
It's
there
true.
was a
But that's the
famine.
thing,
The
like, there's
intentionality
no-
there's no documented intentionality. But
Yeah.
it went very quickly, because this is something that came out after we published the book, and it would have been fun to reflect on when the book was published. This just came out a couple weeks ago in Le Monde Diplomatique. Philip, I have a screenshot saved on my phone of it. Philip Colley, great nephew of journalist Gareth Jones, quote, "My great uncle's legacy must be preserved, but not at the expense of the truth." Journalist Gareth Jones, who brought to light Stalin's famine in Ukraine, again, focusing in Ukraine. Why? Anyway, that's what they do. Stalin's famine in Ukraine in 1932, 1933, frequented Nazi dignitaries. Nazi Germany used his revelations to feed their propaganda. His great-grandnephew argues that erasing these aspects of his life does neither justice to his memory nor his journalistic integrity, etc., etc. The point is that
big surprise. Big surprise.
Surprise, but here's the reason that I bring this up is that there's a united ideological project between fascists and liberals.
Yes.
Like the liberal United States, were they fascist? No. I mean, I know that we like to call liberals fascists. They're and we're not going to get into quoting Stalin about liberals here, but we know. The point is that fascists and liberals are both anti-communist. They both have a vested interest in exaggerating and propagandizing things that actually did happen. Like there was a famine, people did die.
And they're also good imperialists too. They share that among them.
Of course,
they love imperialism. Yeah.
So there is a united ideological project. That's not to say they have the same ideology, but they have the same anti-communist ideological project. And as a result of that, what we see is that the Nazis know that they're extremely anti-communist. They're going to use any of this, reportage to drag Stalin's name through the mud and thereby drag communism through the mud and socialism through the mud. But those same things will be picked up by liberals happily, even though we know that was Nazi propaganda. We know that was Nazi propaganda. But the liberals don't care that it was the Nazis perpetuating that, as long as the target of it is an enemy of themselves. And so that's one of the things that this book is trying to set out to do, is that we have to look at the reasons why there's this constructed narrative and how that narrative is constructed and what the goals of this constructed narrative are, which maybe, they're not put out maybe that succinctly in the book, but that is really like the underlying theme of why and how this narrative is constructed.
Yeah, I mean, as I think of this too, is that you want to like the figures that liberals venerate and like the bourgeois historians venerate, like let's say a guy named Abraham Lincoln, like think of what that guy did to parts of the U.S., not just not the so-called rebels, but also to the indigenous people, right? I mean,
Greatest
this guy was a genocide
in American history.
Yeah, like this is the machine of American imperialism ran through this guy, and they venerate him to this day. If you go to Illinois, it's called Land of Lincoln, right? They still identify with them, and they're baffled to discover that, say, people like in Syria support or stand for Bashar al-Assad. Yeah, like hated as he may be by some of the classes of Syria, there are still people who look up to him and say, "Oh, that violence that he was perpetuating was necessary." Is that a right thing on my part to say? No, I don't know. It's not. Is it for me to say? But no. But the fact that liberals can't fathom that the people they deem to be horrendous monsters share a certain kernel of popular support. So this is true not just for Stalin. This is true for Mao. This is true for Xi Jinping today. This is true for Russia, by the way, that Russia is led by a guy who's very popular, infinitely more popular than the guy who leads my country, Canada. A third of the country supports Trudeau, and 2/3 of Russians more support Russian. I support Putin, I think more. It was at 70 for a while. Maybe it's fallen off a bit, but it's hard to say because it's a wartime. Yeah,
polling and it's
fine.
But no, I mean he is very popular. He's much more popular than either Biden or Trudeau.
Right, and
that's fair to say.
Liberals are able to make so many naturalized explanations for their own corrupt, violent, genocidal, incarcerative, that's not a word, but whatever, you know what I mean, like their own system that makes sense to them. The violence of the liberal state, the modern liberal state, makes sense to them, and they write it off as, well, this is the necessary thing. And we decry police violence, we decry this specific war in this part of the world. But ultimately, they're not revolutionaries. They support their state. So like the fact that they look at the Soviets in the 40s and the 30s, and they were facing down, they were a peasant economy when this guy came, right? And they were like, no, 20s, right? Like they were a peasant economy. What was the way he said the wooden foundations? There was a great line in the introductions, like, wooden plows. Like they had wooden plows. And like this kind of thing that liberals lionize, liberal capitalists lionize modernization programs. They should idolize a guy like Stalin if everything about him is true, if the lies they believe about him is true, because the things like those values are their values, right? Like mass modernization, right? Like lumping together like what we today would call diversity, right? Like the USSR was a multi-ethnic project, right? That like Stalin wrote on the national question, right? Like Stalin was explicitly an anti-racist, right? Like there's a reason why like Africans in large numbers like look to Stalin as a potential example, right? Like African communists. Like this is not unthinkable. And so it's so hilarious that like the charges that they throw at Stalin, it's like that should make you like him more. Like the things that you think are heroic in your bourgeois leaders, but it's just a basic thing. It just exposes you to the fact that at the level of individuals and also their kind of like publications and whatever, and like how they express themselves, you can't resolve all these contradictions. Like it's impossible. You can't sit there and like no human being could sit there and assess 30 years of Soviet Union history that this guy's life like curtailed. Like we're talking about a vast country with 100 million people at a time when human life was on the move in insane numbers, right? 60 million killed in World War II alone. Forget the occurrences of the 1930s and the shocks of the 50s and 60s and the genocidal, like, you know, like forget all that stuff. And yet they think that they have this collection of like this little FAQ sheet about this guy named Joseph Stalin, and they like read off of it, and like that's it. Like it's because they ultimately they don't think much of the populations of the world. They don't think of their projects. They don't think of histories. They think of them as stupid and like beneath them, and their chauvinism shows when they like push their rancor to be like, oh, Stalin bad. And meanwhile, they live in the US. Like every single thing people accuse Stalin of happens every day in the US. Like they gladly do it. So yeah, I mean, it's like we live in this strange kind of like ideological Gordian knot where like the violence of the bourgeois state is venerated and celebrated. Like they call it Independence Day, for God's sakes. They talk about independence, right? Like this imperial project that's like globe spanning. They use the language of bourgeois freedom and call it independence, right? When you're talking about like a class of settler colonials who wanted to break away from the elite that like spawned them and forge their own like slaveholding elite. And this is what they call independence, right? So like it's not, I find it so funny that oftentimes communists find themselves on the back foot talking about communism, and it's like, no, just push it back at liberals. Be like, oh yeah, here's the skulls of the bisons and the buffalo that were collected to starve the indigenous people. This is what you stand for. This is your system.
Exactly.
Find me the equivalent. The Holodomor happened everywhere in North America, in like Turtle Island, right? Like it happened across the continent, north and south too, by the way, like South America too. Like this immense violence of bourgeois states that goes back centuries. Like that should make them the biggest Stalinists of them all. If what they say about Stalin is true.
People need to read Losurdo to understand this. Yeah. I mean, they don't need to, but if you do, you'll have a deep understanding of it. His book Liberalism is on this.
Exactly.
You know, the mythology.
This is kind of a companion book to that almost.
It is.
In many ways, I would say so. And I know we have. I don't know if this will come out before or not, but on November 14th, we're having a panel discussion for the Toronto Public Library, where it's going to be Salvatore and myself, Gabriel Rockhill, Jennifer Ponce de Leon, and Roger
Roderick.
Day
Yep.
on a panel talking about Losurdo's oeuvre and specifically looking at the Stalin book, liberalism. I think War and Revolution is the third one that we're going to be talking about, and Western Marxism.
Yes. Yeah, I think
so. You know, we are going to be talking about those connections on that venue as well. So, you know, listeners, hop on in, because otherwise, you know, it's just the Toronto Public Library. You know, the people in the audience there may not be very friendly to us. So we could use a few of you there to, you know, hold the line. But in any case, no, that book really is looking at the mythology of what liberalism says it stands for, and then examining what liberalism is actually built upon in much the same way that you just you know, talked about, Sina. So I know that you've read that work. I don't know how long ago you read it, but you know, other listeners, if you like what Sina was saying there and you find that valuable, which you should, because it's all absolutely true, check out the liberalism book as well. I mean, I don't get anything for you know, you checking out the liberalism book, but you get a lot by reading it.
Absolutely. I wanted to return to the narrative aspect so that it is crystal clear to anybody who's going to be reading Losurdo's book on that we translated as exactly sort of taking a part of this narrative that is whose purpose is really to bash any communist project, or any leftist project, actually. One of the things that I wanted to remark upon is to return to what Sina, you were saying as well, is that in this discussion, I've not felt compelled necessarily to preface anything about Stalin by denouncing Stalin and by saying stuff like that. But that's where we are in this context, unfortunately, and that includes, of course, most of the left. In which, if you say the word Stalin, then you have to always genuflect to the prevailing ideology. And one of the things that there was a stark contrast that I experienced some time ago. Now it's almost been maybe like 15 years. The couple of times that I went to India, it was you could talk about Stalin in a very sane manner, and you would not have been accused of promoting mass slaughter, prison camps, and stuff like that. It was well understood what the context of the USSR was, because we are in North America and Western Europe primarily, but also now, unfortunately, Central and Eastern Europe, because I lived in Hungary as well. We're grossly undereducated and disinformed about the basics. And that includes on the left. So, this is why it's important to have these podcasts, because the educational institutions are diseducational institutions with respect to socialist movements and socialist histories. And so it was quite incredible. I found that I did not have to explain myself if I talked about the USSR. Instead, I would find myself in academic contexts as well in North America, in which the sheer mention of the USSR immediately says Stalin, gulags, mass death. And this is just to go back to your initial, as part of the initial conversation that you were engaging us with, Sina, with respect to the logical sequence that is behind this narrative, and so it's really sad, because why doesn't one should not have to say, well, actually, yeah, I think that thousands of death warrants signed by Stalin is probably I wouldn't agree with that. But do I have to necessarily say that in order to say, well, the USSR was a worthwhile project? Yeah. This is the sad reality here.
Which is what they never ask about the violence of bourgeois leaders, right? Exactly. Like that's never something that is addressed to the history of other states. It's always framed as, oh, our enemies, they behave like this. Oh, they execute people. Yep. Oh, China's one-child policy. Oh, Tiananmen Square. Like, right. It's like, are you kidding me? Like, no. I mean, like they make the project of keeping a certain image of certain sort of power and great men of British and American history alive is $1 billion industry. They made Lincoln. They made Darkest Hour. Liberal people specifically, because that's who it's made for, right? Like conservatives don't watch Lincoln. They don't watch Maybe they watch Darkest Hour. That's different. But like Like it's made for a certain kind of veneration of a class of people, and it's sold and it's celebrated as this neutral thing. Now you can make the argument that, oh, there's a ton of people who criticize Stalin, like criticize, Churchill now and everything, but at the level of are you kidding? Like the things that all the crimes you can throw at Stalin, there's far more you can throw at the figures that, but the figures that we venerate. And on top of that, they're still pushing to like they made the death of Stalin a few years ago, right? Like there is an ideological project that's ongoing to make anything associated with the USSR, with communism, with that, and also Stalin himself, with a kind of buffoonery and like wasted Soviet opulence and murder and starvation and gulags and all this stuff. And yet I realize now that, like, the older I get, that all of that stuff is a kind of like it's a psychological salve or a kind of place to project the crimes of the states that we live in that are so many and so ongoing. So you need a kind of crucible to then put those things on and say, well, at least we're not that. At least we didn't do that, right? Like Lincoln was bad, but he's not Stalin. Like it's like, and so like that. This is one of those moments where, like, the ideas of individuals, you can see how the gears work, and how there has been this like very, very like broad scale or like project whereby a whole multiple generations of cultural figures, historians, journalists, whatever, all pull on the same rope, which is, USSR failed, USSR bad, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, KFC good. And this is where we're stuck. I mean, and forget that fact. Now, with the last 3 years or 2 years now, we've had Nazism as like the open ally, right? Like they've brought back Nazi. It's okay now, right? It's okay to be a Nazi now. It's better. It's better than being, it's better than being pro-Russian, because that's like, this is where we've reached. Liberals are losing their marbles. The few marbles that they had as a class, they are losing them. And I realize now, this genocidal war in Palestine, they were ramping us up for it with the Ukraine stuff. They were preparing for like kind of hysterica and like the widespread cynical kind of like weaponization of, oh, you can't say good things you can't be on the side of my enemy, how dare you, chasing down anyone, killing Duggan's daughter in a car bomb and then laughing about it. Like, back in my day, we called that terrorism, right? But like liberals are like, haha, like they've all just become like NAFO losers, and like all just sitting there like Timothy Snyder, whatever, like they're all just like frothing at the mouth, pushing for like siding with and apologizing for Ukrainian Banderites, and how they're like sending all kinds of Ukrainians to their graves by the hundreds of thousands, and just saying, oh, well, it's worth it, like this is what they think of Stalinism. They're doing it, like the reckless expenditure of human life, right? Like the like the hyper nationalism, the authoritarianism. These are all the things that they think are Stalinism. No, that's what you're supporting in Ukraine. That's what you're endorsing and signaling as like what you love. Like Paul Massero putting Bandera patch on his arm and being like, look what I got, guys. Like, this is like, you're doing ideological like groundwork laying for fascism's like convenient return in the name of fighting Asiatic Russian hordes. I mean, that's it. That's where we are.
Sina, everything that you say is fine and well, but the real question is, do you condemn Hamas? Just as I obviously I'm saying that tongue in cheek and as an explicit joke, but what you said in terms of how you are expected to justify Stalin or everything that happened under Stalin, if you are a Marxist-Leninist or even a socialist, that doesn't happen with other figures, even though you said, and rightly so, that some of these figures like Churchill are starting to get more, criticism and popular discourse these days than they did in decades past. But just think, if you say I'm a communist, or let's say I'm in favor of Stalin, like the worst thing that you can say to any like polite liberal, the first thing that they say is, how do you justify the Holodomor? How do you justify the gulags? Or even if you don't say anything about Stalin, and this is the point of the book. I know that, it sounds like we're kind of ranting off topic, but this is actually like directly the point of the book. If you say, I'm a socialist, you don't have to mention the word Stalin. The next thing that comes out of a liberal's mouth is, how do you justify the gulags? How do you justify the purges? How do you justify the Holodomor? You don't have to say anything about Stalin directly. This is part of that construction of the narrative about Stalin. That doesn't happen with liberal figures or conservative figures. That doesn't happen when somebody says, I liked the New Deal. If you say, I like the New Deal, people don't go, well, how do you justify the internment camps? How do you justify, hey, Abraham Lincoln, that was a pretty cool guy. How do you justify massacring more Native Americans in a single day than any other president in American history? Like, that is not the next thing out of somebody's mouth if you say, Abraham Lincoln, he wasn't too bad. FDR, he wasn't too bad. If somebody says Winston Churchill, you might get into a little bit of a debate, but the next thing out of the person's mouth is, how do you justify killing 3 million people in Bengal intentionally by manufacturing a famine? Like, that is not part of the discourse, and that would be considered like very inappropriate for a social setting, but that is just given that is the first thing that you hear, something similar to that, when Stalin's name is invoked or socialism is invoked. That's the point of this book. You don't have to love Stalin. You don't have to like Stalin. If you're a socialist or a communist and you pick up this book, what you'll notice is that the point of this book is so that we understand that this narrative was created in order to be used like this, in a way that it would never be used for any non-communist, exactly. You always think of George W. Bush. If people go, I'm thinking about voting for the Republican Party, the next thing that comes out of a liberal's mouth is not, how dare you think about, massacring Iraqi children, Afghan. They maybe say like, hey, they're not going to bring up specific instances and call them genocidaires because they support the party that George W. Bush was a part of, for example. But if you say that you're a socialist, they don't ask, oh, interesting. Are you a Trotskyist? Are you a Marxist-Leninist? Are you a Maoist? Are you an anarchist? Are you, a syndicalist? Like, whatever. It doesn't matter to them. They hear the word socialism and they're conditioned by the society to use Stalin as a cudgel, and some of these things that in many cases were fabricated, in other cases were exaggerated, in other cases there's a kernel of truth to them, but they're conditioned to use these as a cudgel immediately upon the invocation of these terms: Stalin, communism, socialism, Soviet Union, China, Cuba. It doesn't matter if Stalin was involved there or not. The Cuban Revolution didn't have success until 1959. Stalin had already been dead for 6 years, but you still hear about purges, Holodomor, if you talk about supporting the Cuban Revolution. What is this? It's because people are conditioned by the society that they grow up in, and this narrative was ingrained within the society in order to be used for this specific reason. And that's actually why this book exists. It's not an examination of Stalin the man. It's an examination of how this narrative is constructed and how it's utilized. And it's utilized every single day against you if you're on the left. And that's why this is a vital work for you to read, regardless of what you think of Stalin.
And Sina, what you were saying earlier, if I may just briefly, there is a very evident racialized component to this narrative. Losurdo doesn't go so much into it, but he kind of touches upon that here and there, and maybe not as thoroughly as I would have liked. But there is that, sort of the Asiatic hordes kind of construct is just around the corner of that, and the same unfortunately goes with a lot of leftists in settler colonial countries like ours. I mean, it's just they fall for this as well. So they go, obviously, these people in the East cannot possibly build socialism, right? Unlike the utter and complete failure of the left in the imperialist countries over and over again. Which also brings out another topic that Losurdo touches upon, which is, sort of the abstract universalism problem. But I don't know whether we would want to go into that. But Sina, you wanted to say something, and I was saying to be brief.
No,
yeah.
it's I think you should go ahead. Keep going. We got lots of time still.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Well, then the abstract universalism aspect is a not very veiled, very deep critique of a lot of leftist currents, historical. Some of the ones that were involved also within the Bolshevik Party, and especially it's a not very thinly veiled critique of his contemporaries, a lot of his contemporaries, and I think that was why the book in Italy in particular was assailed by part of the communist movement, some of the intellectuals. So that was, sort of the understanding being that you have. I mean, what also Losurdo would say is a justifiable understanding of history in which, okay, now we've got the revolution and the expectations are very high, and we're going to have our socialist society, and and of course, as soon as that fails, or as soon as it's the reality hits that it's much lower than the expected results, you do have some tendencies in some currents to be very critical, to behave in such a way as to actually undermine the process of socialism construction, because they won't accept anything less than the full development of socialism, even within their lifetimes or even the next minute. In some respects, I see that on the left in the United States, these kinds of ahistorical expectations or context-free expectations. And that also affects strategies, and then it creates tensions, and even though there are critiques that are very justifiable critiques, like for example the workers' opposition, certainly a very justifiable critique when Lenin was in leadership. However, there were also unreasonable expectations within their ranks as to what was possible in the 1920s. So this abstract universalism also runs through what Losurdo calls so he uses the term anarchoid kind of perspective, which is not too different from, I guess, the debate about utopian versus scientific socialism. So it's something that runs through socialist histories from the beginning, in my view. And Losurdo is also I wouldn't say just critical of it, but something that he warns us about as being the sort of expectations that can lead to the opposite of what could be built. And it said worsen situations much more than would be necessary. I mean, he doesn't say exactly this, but that's kind of the debate, I suppose, that is implicit in what he presents in my reading. And this abstract universalism is something that is, it takes many forms, and I've just touched on a few, but it is what actually enables not a few Marxists to reject the USSR as a project, to claim that the People's Republic of China is just fully capitalist.
They call it Eastern Marxism. That's the best part. They call it Eastern.
Yes.
Like, yes. The East one, that's the bad one. Don't do that one. Do the West one. Yeah, West one. The one that accomplished nothing.
Yeah, the white settler one. I mean, really. I mean, it's ridiculous. But exactly. That is the response that Losurdo is giving them in some respects. I mean, I grew up in part under Eurocommunism, and we see the benefit of that in hindsight now. What a complete failure that was. And the Italian Communist Party imploded so easily in the early 1990s, I think in part, not necessarily because of that, but in part because of that. There were also geopolitical reasons, and I wouldn't want to simplify. But, it's just, yeah, exactly. Eastern Marxism. It's like, Mwalimu Nyerere was not a socialist, or wasn't a socialist enough because the Ujamaa obviously failed. Well, then you see what the aftermath of the Ujamaa was when it was made to fail, and we can see what Tanzania looks like now. And, all the promising aspects of Ujamaa were swept aside, and we just have a neo-colony. It's just, what I don't understand. It's people who also praise Sankara, Sankara until Sankara actually lives beyond, like 4 years. in
they like him
power.
because he's a martyr, and it's safe
Exactly.
to memorialize him. But God forbid you like take a secular reading of actually like long-term like communist projects that like
Exactly.
yeah, like it's a there is. I mean, if anything, the story here, and we got to kind of wrap it up soon.
Oh yeah, sorry.
But like,
yeah.
if anything, the story here is, I think the widespread illiteracy on the part of people in the global north, like as a whole, that like they're impoverished educationally, that they're raised in like bourgeois, like anti-communist, like football spiking. We won the Cold War. And also in Europe, you're talking about American dominated. Europe is occupied by America. Let's be real.
Tell me about it.
It's occupied.
We have 17 US military bases in Italy.
Yeah.
So-
Are you kidding me? You think that doesn't have an ideological component that's just military? You think that doesn't have like an active project that like replicates the American system, that like, like all those movies they filmed and bombed out Italy wasn't part of like a strategy of like inflecting American values and the ideas of Americans and how they talk, and it's like that's part of the game of American soft power, is that you convince them that every real threat to it, they're the baddies, like they're the real ones, that like, oh, the Islamic people who took over in Iran, they're the baddies, oh, those communists in blank, they're the baddies, right? That like, oh, it's never us. And so like, Europeans, they're watching now as they're being de-developed by the mafia that runs them. They're being forced to like extract more wealth, like people freezing in their homes in winter because brr Putin, like that meme of like the person taking a cold shower saying, "Take that, Putin," like Putin, like that's like the reality of like European pensioners who grew up in the aftermath of 68. In the aftermath, it's like, oh yeah, you wanted an American alliance? Here's your American alliance. Like, this is what you wanted. Here's your land of freedom. Like, you're now being de-developed by neocon goons, and you're gonna pay more for your pasta because we said so, right? Like, they have no sovereignty. Europeans have no sovereignty as a whole. They're just, and they like send around their little blonde-eyed, like Nazi fun whatever, like fun Panzer or whatever her name is, von der Leyen.
Von der Leyen.
Yeah, von der Leyen. And like, it's a joke. It's a complete joke. And you're convincing me that this is called their European Union. Like, it's hilarious. Like, I've vacillated on this, and I was like, oh, it's a fitting end to Europe, that they're being colonized by the like offspring of their own offspring, and like being humiliated, and like they're clapping for them one by one for de-developing their economies. It's like, thank you. Please take our wealth, please. Like, would you like to loot our museums that are itself looted? Like, that's like the next step here in all of this. But yeah, I mean, yeah, if there's anything that the lesson of this book is that like we have a deeply, deeply impoverished view of world history, and it's infected us on so many levels, and it's like inflected with so many like just chauvinistic, idiotic, like Western imperialist tropes and motifs, and one of them being that Stalin bad, no matter what, that erases this entire decades-long history of work. I mean, when I lived in East Berlin, a ton of people I met missed East Berlin. They were proud of the accomplishments of the DDR. They lament for those days. And sure, you could say that like, oh, boomers here, they lament for the past. That like, oh, that's part of living. But like, these people were ideologically very pro-Stalin. That Stalin for them represented a kind of governance and like a stability that they found like worthwhile, that they fought for, that they like survived the horrors of like post-war like German life, like being bombed to smithereens, right? Like by like Dresden. I mean, yeah, Soviet army did it too. But like the idea that like that the Germans now like look at their fate, that they're in the hands of like occupied by America. They're like they're basically like the little lily pad. Their country is like a lily pad for the U.S. empire. Like last night, like a bunch of guys got injured in a drone attack in Iraq and Syria. They flew them to Ramstein. Like that's it. They have like that's all you are. You're like a lily pad where you host the mercenaries of the people who like colonized you and who are like your suzerain leaders, right? Like that's what we're talking about. who are de-developing your economies, who are not letting you have cheap energy from Russia. They blew up your cheap energy lifeline. And so you can't make your precious cars anymore without paying for American LNG. I mean, it's perfect. Thank you, fellas. I got to run. Thank you so much, Henry. Thank you so much, Salvatore. This was a great episode. Thank you for your work. Thank you for this book. I hope people read it. I hope people read and have a more sort of secular and less hysterical view of these histories, and sort of open yourself up to a kind of like, non anti-Stalinist, a non like bourgeois worldview. Any closing thoughts from either of you?
I'll just hop in and say that I recommend that the listeners read the book, and that's not just because I was involved with it, but it's a really important book. But also something that I'm not sure that we mentioned earlier, but is really important, is that the PDF is available for free. Like, that was one of the big reasons why we were so enthusiastic to work with Iskra Books, because they are a political project first and a publisher second. They really care about getting the material out there for this political project. And so with this book and all of their books, the PDF is available for free. And so when they offered to, get the rights for this book so that we could legally do it, we were very happy about it, because then we know, hey, listeners, economic times are hard. Believe me, I know. Well, okay.
You've been sanctioned.
I have been sanctioned. No, really, it's like almost impossible for me to visit my family because I get paid
You're
in
Iranian
rubles.
now, Henry. Welcome.
Yeah, I can't convert my money into dollars. So it's like, the meager earnings that we get in guerrilla history that I don't spend on books, I have to save up for like a year and a half to afford plane tickets to visit my family. I get to visit my family once in the last 3 years. I wanted to go this winter, not going to be able to. In the summer, that's my next goal, is save up for the summer. So,
they must love you at the U.S. border.
Oh, yeah, let me tell you. No, but listeners, okay, so, if you want to buy the print copy, we do. Salvatore and I get a very, very small bit. It's not that, like, Iskra is paying us very little. It's that they're a nonprofit publisher. Like, they also get very little per copy, so don't think that they're exploiting us for it. We get an equal cut of it. But the most important thing to understand, listeners, is that we did this book for political reasons and ideological reasons, and getting this out there to as many people as possible was the reason that we wanted to do it, and why we were so happy to do it with Iskra. So go to iskrabooks.org. I think it's iskrabooks.org. God, I pulled a blank.
I'll link it. Don't worry.
I think it's iskrabooks.org.
Yeah.
You can download the PDF for free. If you, like me, are in a tough economic situation, just download the PDF and read it. That is the most important thing. The print copies look awesome, and like I really love having a print copy of this book. So, again, if you're like me, feel free to grab a copy, but download it for free. Like, that is, just read it.
As for me, I would strongly recommend the same as Henry, and also to look at all these socialist histories seriously. There are so many, to learn from them and to really confront the contradictions and the context, the historical context in which they happen, and not to just dismiss millions of people who devoted their lives, sacrificed their lives for the cause. And that it's the very least that one could ask of people like me, for example. And I can't thank you enough, Sina, for having us on and for enabling us this conversation, and to promote one of the most worthwhile texts at least I've encountered. I guess the other ones being, I wanted to pitch in also a little bit about Gerald Horne's work, if one wants to really understand liberalism and what it is really.
Should we
practice.
have Salvatore tease the upcoming translation at all?
Oh yes, I was going to mention that too. Thank you, Henry.
We just got greenlit for the project.
Yeah, exactly. There's a comrade in France who wrote a book that came out in 2018 and that I could not get a hold of. And in hindsight, I so desperately wish I would have. It would have informed my own book. It's by Guillaume Suing, Suing, and it's called L'écologie réelle, Real Ecology. And it's an exploration of the accomplishments on the environmental front by the USSR and Cuba. And so that we hope to have that ready, I don't know, hopefully by next year, earlier than the end of next year, and it will be another, I think, important volume for people to read, especially those who are assailed by a lot of nonsense with respect to the environmental destruction that is oftentimes associated with the USSR. I'll leave it at that, I suppose. But that's by Guillaume Swang.
And that'll also be coming out from Iskra. Therefore, the PDF will also
Exactly.
be free when it comes out. So listeners, look forward to that.
Thank you, Henry. Yep.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you so much.
Thank
All right,
you
thanks.
very much. Take care.